My name is Natalie Harper, and for months my apartment smelled like stale coffee and unwashed blankets. The blinds stayed shut even at noon. I learned the creaks of the floorboards by heart, mapping safe routes that kept me away from the mirror in the hallway. When deliveries came, I waited, breath held, until footsteps faded, like a fugitive in my own home. I hid inside books the way a child hides under a tablecloth seen by no one, hearing everything, paperbacks stacked like bricks around my bed, titles about far countries and brave bodies I didn't own. Eating was quiet, secret, crackers crushed over a bowl, a spoon dragging slow through peanut butter, crumbs wiped with the heel of my hand before anyone, even me, could notice. The scale in the bathroom stopped telling the truth and began telling stories. Tomorrow, later, not today. I unplugged it like an irritating radio. Clothes came from dark websites that promised comfort and measurements instead of letters. I wore sweaters even in summer, a soft armor against glances that weren't there, against the memory of laughter behind me in grocery lines. Nights were longest. The apartment hummed refrigerator, neighbor's TV, pipes knocking, like someone politely asking to be let in. I prayed without posture, face buried in the pillow, words spilling sideways. Please don't forget me. Please make tomorrow small enough to carry. When sleep came, it arrived like a delayed train, screeching and exhausted, and I climbed aboard clutching my breath. The book found me on a Tuesday, buried under coupons in a secondhand box by my door. A stranger's name on the first page, a famous preacher on the cover. I turned one line, then another. Something warm clicked inside my ribs, a pilot light catching, small but stubborn against winter air. The book stayed on my nightstand, its edges frayed, as though it had been waiting there long before I touched it. The preacher's words weren't complicated. They were steady, like a hand resting on your shoulder when you don't expect it. One passage spoke of hope not as a feeling but as a presence that walks into the darkest rooms. I reread that line until the letters blurred, until my throat ached. I wasn't sure if I believed it. Belief felt like an expensive coat I could never afford, but I kept turning pages night after night, and then, as if by accident, I pulled my old Bible from the bottom shelf. Its spine cracked when I opened it, releasing dust like a sigh. I read pieces I remembered from childhood, words about light, mercy, new beginnings. For the first time in years, silence in my apartment didn't sound empty, it sounded like waiting. The weeks after that, I found myself watching church services online. At first, I kept the volume low, like a guilty pleasure. The hymns seeped through my headphones, voices rising and falling, voices that didn't know me but somehow carried me. A woman on the screen said, "God meets us where we are, even in hidden places." I paused the video and cried into my sleeve. Slowly, I began to wonder what would happen if I left the apartment, if I dared to sit among those people in real life. The thought terrified me. What if they stared? What if I couldn't fit in the pew? What if I broke under their gaze? Yet, inside all that fear, there was also a strange pulse, something alive, urging me forward. Before we move on, let me pause here. If this story touched you, please subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment below. Tell me your city and country, and also share what first step you dream of taking in your own life. I'd love to read your answers. I used to tell myself I wasn't hiding. I was simply choosing comfort, choosing privacy. But when weeks melted into months and the sound of my own voice startled me, I knew the truth. I was a prisoner. My body had become the cell, and my shame, the guard. The curtains never opened. The world existed on the other side of glass I refused to touch. The mirror in the hallway became my greatest enemy. I draped a towel over it, but sometimes the corner slipped, and I would catch a glimpse rounded shoulders, a face I didn't recognize, eyes swollen from sleep and salt. Those glimpses felt like knives. I learned to keep my head down, to walk quickly past as though someone dangerous lived there. Food was both punishment and anesthesia. Nights, I ordered takeout. I never finished. The smell of grease, thick in the air, clinging to my skin. I ate fast, as if swallowing might erase loneliness. But the emptiness only grew heavier. Plates piled in the sink until I couldn't look at them. Some mornings, I opened the fridge and wept at the sight of wilted lettuce, bought with promises I had broken again. Friends stopped calling after unanswered texts, unanswered birthdays. My mother left voicemails that grew shorter each week, first warm, then worried, then polite. I told myself they didn't care, but in truth, I couldn't bear to hear care offered and not believe I deserved it. Silence became easier than explaining. The outside world felt impossible. I remembered squeezing into theater seats, the burn of seatbelts digging into my chest, the whispers at clothing stores when nothing fit. Those memories looped inside me, convincing me I wasn't built for sidewalks or restaurants or conversations. So I stayed inside, convincing myself I was safer here. Nights were the hardest. The apartment walls closed in, humming with appliances and regret. I left the TV running for company, voices filling the room so I didn't have to hear my own thoughts. But at 2 a.m, when the programs turned strange and static crept across the screen, I lay awake, heart thudding, begging for sleep. Once, in the middle of a storm, I tried to pray. The words stumbled out like broken teeth. God, I don't even know if you hear me anymore. My voice cracked, and for a moment I thought the thunder was laughing. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, ashamed of even asking. Yet a part of me, the smallest, quietest part, hoped someone was listening. Books were the only place I felt safe. I stacked them in towers against the walls, novels that carried me to cities I'd never see, biographies of people who had conquered mountains I couldn't climb. But every time I closed a book, my own story came rushing back, raw and unfinished. The characters had courage. I had curtains. Sometimes, while sipping cold coffee gone bitter, I imagined a different life, walking into a cafe without shrinking, wearing clothes that didn't feel like armor, smiling without apology. These daydreams dissolved as quickly as they formed, leaving me with a heaviness so real it pressed against my chest. I told myself such dreams weren't for me, and yet, in the middle of that heavy silence, a stubborn ember refused to die. I didn't know it then, but every whispered prayer, every restless night, every tear shed on the kitchen floor was feeding something fragile and holy. It waited beneath the ashes of my despair, patient, until the day it would finally spark. The book arrived by accident, or at least that's what I thought. A cardboard box sat outside my door, tucked against the frame like it didn't want to be noticed. I hadn't ordered anything that week. Inside were a few used novels, their covers bent, their spines broken, as if they'd already lived other lives. And there, at the bottom, under a stack of yellowed coupons, was a thin volume with a preacher's name on the cover, Billy Graham. I stared at it for a long time, suspicious. Religious books had never been part of my library. My shelves were filled with stories where people traveled, fell in love, won wars, or solved mysteries. Faith belonged to someone else's world, not mine. Yet I turned the first page, The dedication was simple, written to those who feel forgotten. My throat tightened. That night, I read until my eyes burned. The preacher wrote about despair not as a permanent address, but as a temporary stop, about hope as a presence that walks into locked rooms. I underlined that sentence with a trembling hand. Locked rooms. I knew them too well. It felt as if the book had been written for me, to me, whispering through the silence I had been drowning in. I cried until the pages blurred. The tears weren't neat or graceful. They were ugly, loud, wet against my sweatshirt. But something in me cracked open. For the first time in months, my sobbing wasn't just grief, was released, like a window opening in a suffocating room. I whispered into the air, "Are you really there?" and waited, even though I didn't expect an answer. In the following days, I kept the book on my nightstand, touching it like a fragile relic. Between bites of cereal or sips of cold coffee, I turned another page. The words didn't shame me. They didn't demand perfection. Instead, they suggested possibility, and possibility was something I had buried long ago. One evening, restless and unable to sleep, I reached for another book, one I hadn't touched in years. My old Bible sat dusty on the bottom shelf, its cover warped, its pages yellowed. I opened it carefully, afraid it might fall apart in my hands. The spine cracked, releasing a smell of paper and time. My eyes fell on words about light shining in darkness. I stopped breathing for a moment. Could light find its way even here? Night after night, I read first the preacher, then the scriptures. I didn't understand everything. Sometimes I read the same verse 10 times, waiting for it to sink in. But slowly, something shifted. The silence in my apartment no longer felt hollow. It felt alive, as though someone was waiting there with me, unseen but steady. Eventually, I wandered onto the internet and stumbled into church live streams. At first, I kept the volume low, like a guilty secret. The songs rose in my headphones, harmonies of strangers who somehow felt like family. A woman on the screen said, "God meets us where we are even in hidden places." I froze. Hidden places. That was me. Tears spilled again, but this time they were softer, less lonely. I began to crave those nights. I lit a candle on the coffee table before watching the services, the flame flickering like a heartbeat, the glow reflected off the dark window, reminding me that there was still fire in me, however small. I sang along quietly, my voice shaky, out of tune, but alive. For the first time, I wasn't embarrassed by the sound of myself. Something had awakened. I didn't know where it would lead, and part of me was terrified to find out. But the thought had already planted itself, stubborn and bright. Maybe I could step outside again. Maybe I could walk into a place where these voices lived, where people didn't just sing on screens, but with arms and faces and breath. The idea scared me, but it also pulled me forward, like a thread tightening in my chest, leading me toward something I could no longer ignore. The Sunday I chose came dressed in pale sun, the kind that makes dust look like glitter. I stood at the door for 10 minutes, keys in hand, rehearsing reasons to stay laundry, a headache, another live stream later. My heart wouldn't believe me. I put on the only dress that still fit without a war, a navy blue that used to be looser, and a cardigan for courage. When I finally stepped into the hallway, my legs trembled as if gravity had doubled. The parking lot was already filling when I pulled in. People moved in, clusters, families, couples, a few loners like me. I parked far from the entrance to avoid the tide. then regretted the distance when the Texas heat leaped off the pavement and wrapped my ankles. Each step from the car felt like crossing a border. I kept my eyes on the ground, counting the cracks in the asphalt, anything to avoid faces. The glass doors reflected me before I could look away. For a heartbeat, I saw the roundness of my body, the cardigan straining where it didn't used to, the purse strap cutting a line across my shoulder. Shame rose like a hot tide. My breath hitched. I almost turned around. Then a man in a red volunteer lanyard opened the door, smiling like the morning wasn't holding its breath for me. "Good morning," he said. Not a glance up and down, not a flicker of surprise, just the words. I walked in because I needed to prove to myself I still could. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. Children darted like bright birds between adults. A table held bulletins and pens. My fingers itched to take one, to have something to hold. I scanned for judgment and found none, just ordinary faces carrying their own private storms. A woman my mother's age stood nearby with a tray of small cups. "Welcome," she said, eyes soft. "First time." I nodded, my mouth too dry to answer. "We're glad you're here." The sentence landed like a blanket over my shoulders. Inside the sanctuary, the lights were warm and kind. I chose a seat near the back, the way someone with a suitcase chooses the aisle. The pew was wider than I remembered from childhood churches. I didn't have to wedge myself in or make apologies to my neighbors. I exhaled a slow, surprised exhale that loosened something in my ribs. Around me, people settled, rustle of programs, coughs, the hush of anticipation. I kept my hands on my lap to hide their shaking. The music began, a gentle guitar under a river of voices. Lyrics bloomed on the screens, simple words about mercy arriving like morning. I tried to sing, but my throat closed. Instead, I mouthed the lines, letting them move through my mouth like a promise I wasn't ready to say out loud. My eyes swam. I pressed my palms together, not in a show, just to keep myself from coming apart. A quiet prayer formed without grammar. "If you see me, keep me here, please." When the pastor spoke, he didn't thunder. He talked like someone describing a road he'd walked himself. The way shame makes rooms smaller. The way kindness kicks a window open. He said, "Some of us came today convinced we're too much or not enough. But you're not a problem to be fixed, you're a person to be loved." My body reacted before my mind did. Heat rushed to my face. I held back, a sob that stung like smoke. It felt as if he had found the locked door in my chest and jiggled the key gently until it turned. After the benediction, I stayed seated, waiting for the crowd to thin. An older woman with silver hair and eyes the color of rain paused at the end of my pew. She wore a floral dress and the kind of smile that doesn't show off. "I'm Ruth," she said. "I don't think we've met." I introduced myself in a voice 2 sizes too small. Ruth didn't blink. "I'm so glad you came, Natalie." She reached for my hand, warm and dry. "You are loved here." The sentence cracked me open. Tears spilled before I could stop them. Ruth squeezed. "That's the best kind of water," she whispered, "the kind that tells the soil it can grow." In the lobby, she steered me toward a table where another volunteer handed out cards for small groups and a weekly walking club. "Only as you're comfortable," Ruth said, reading the panic on my face and translating it as tenderness. "Sometimes we just walk to the end of the block and back. The point is walking together." She didn't utter a single sentence about diets or discipline, not a single look that measured me. She asked about my week, my favorite authors, whether I took my coffee with cream, ordinary questions that made space where I had expected a verdict. By the time I reached the car, the sky had shifted to a deeper blue, like it had been washed. My dress clung to the back of my knees with sweat. My cheeks were tight with dried tears. I sat behind the wheel and let quiet fill the cabin. The world hadn't ended because I had stepped into it. No one had laughed. No pew had groaned. Instead, hands had opened doors. Voices had braided around me. A stranger had called me by my name. On the drive home, I whispered a thank you that felt too small for what it tried to carry. The candle on my coffee table would burn that night and the next and the next. I didn't know it yet, but the walk from my car to the church doors had been the first mile of a longer road, one that would teach my body and my soul a new way to move. The weeks after that first visit turned into a rhythm, though nothing about it felt ordinary to me. Every Sunday, I fought the same arguments in my head: stay home, no one will miss you, you don't belong there. And every Sunday, I found myself slipping into that navy dress, clutching my cardigan like armor, and driving across town. The building became less intimidating each time, not because I changed, but because the welcome never faltered. Ruth became my anchor. She sat beside me in services, introduced me to people with gentle nudges, and never once mentioned my body. She spoke about books, gardening, her grandchildren, the price of peaches at the farmer's market. Normal conversations that made me feel like a person, not a problem. Slowly, the fear of being seen began to loosen its claws. One evening after service, Ruth invited me to join the walking club. I wanted to refuse. The thought of moving my body in front of others made my skin crawl. But her invitation was wrapped in warmth, not pressure. Just come for the company, she said. We go slow. We talk more than we walk. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The first walk was short, 15 minutes around the church parking lot. My breath was shallow, my thighs burned, sweat dampened my back. I kept waiting for the sideways glances, the smirks. They never came. Instead, people chatted about recipes, TV shows, prayer requests. One man stopped mid-conversation, just to match my pace. It was the first time I realized exercise didn't have to be punishment. It could be companionship, encouraged. I began walking in my neighborhood on weekdays, at first, just to the end of the block and back, then 2 blocks, then 3. Each step was an argument with the voice in my head that told me I couldn't. Some days, the voice one eye stayed inside, eating my sadness with a fork, but most days, I laced my shoes, whispered a shaky prayer for strength, and opened the door. Food was harder. The habits of secrecy ran deep. But one of the women from church, Angela, invited me to a cooking night at her house. She showed me simple meals, salads that didn't taste like penance, roasted vegetables with garlic and olive oil, grilled chicken seasoned like kindness instead of punishment. I didn't overhaul my life overnight, but I began making small changes, one plate at a time. Progress was messy. Some weeks I lost a pound, others I gained 2 back. I cried over pizza boxes and cursed myself in the mirror. But the church reminded me, gently, that my worth wasn't measured in numbers. On Sundays, when the pastor prayed, I felt the words settle over me like balm. God sees your heart before he sees your body. Slowly, I began to believe it. One afternoon, after a particularly hard week, I collapsed on my couch and whispered, I can't do this. The room was silent, heavy. Then, without thinking, I prayed out loud, God, if you really want me to change, you'll have to carry me. The words left me trembling. But when I stood up and tied my sneakers, it felt as though unseen hands steadied me. Months turned into a year. My clothes grew looser. My face found its cheekbones again. But the deeper change wasn't on the outside. I began to look forward to mornings, to feel my breath expand in my chest without pain. I laughed more freely at church potlucks, joined Bible studies where my voice mattered, and even led a prayer, once my own halting words, but mine. By the end of the second year, I had lost over 30 pounds. My doctor was proud, but what mattered more was the mirror. One morning, I pulled away the towel I had taped to its corner. For the first time in years, I didn't flinch. I saw a woman still soft around the edges, still imperfect, but alive, moving, fighting. I whispered, "Thank you." And this time, I wasn't just speaking to the glass. 2 years passed, and my apartment no longer smelled of stale coffee and shut windows. The curtains were open now, light pouring through like a guest who belonged. My bookshelf was still crowded, but the books leaned against trophies of a different kind: worn sneakers, resistance bands, recipe cards stained with olive oil. Every object told a story of miles walked, meals cooked, prayers whispered, tears shed and dried. I had lost more than 30 pounds, but numbers were no longer the headline. The real victory was the way I could climb stairs without gasping, the way my clothes fit without shame, the way laughter came easily uncoiled and free. People at church noticed, of course, but they didn't applaud the scale. They celebrated the life blooming behind my eyes. Ruth never let me forget where it began. "You showed up," she'd say, patting my hand as if that single act was the bravest thing she'd ever seen. And maybe it was. The first mile, the first prayer, the first yes to community. That's where the miracle had started. Weight loss was only the echo. By then, I had joined a small group for women who struggled with self-image. Some battled food, others depression, others abusive words from their past. We met in a circle of folding chairs at the church basement, coffee brewing in the corner. I told them my story, voice shaking, and watched their faces soften, eyes filling with recognition. One woman whispered, "Me, too." That was enough to keep me going. I started walking with newcomers the way Ruth once walked with me. Sometimes we didn't talk about diets or exercise at all. We talked about sleepless nights, about prayers that felt unanswered, about shame that clung like smoke. Side by side, step by step, we let our bodies remind us we were still moving forward, no matter how slowly. Depression still visited now and then, but it no longer chained me. When the heaviness pressed against my chest, I lit a candle on the coffee table, just as I had in those early livestream nights. Watching the flame steady itself reminded me that my spirit, too, had learned not to flicker out. I prayed differently now, not with desperation, but with trust. "Stay with me, Lord, and I'll keep walking." My family saw the difference. My mother cried the first time I visited without the oversized sweaters, my arms bare, my smile unforced. "You're glowing," she said, and I realized she wasn't talking about my body at all. For the first time, I believed her. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was becoming. Church became more than a place to hide in the back row. I began volunteering, greeting strangers at the door. I watched women like me hesitant, guarded, tugging cardigans tight walk in with fear in their eyes. And when I smiled and said, "We're glad you're here," I meant it with a depth only someone who had once fled those same doors could carry. Hope had become my language, not the airy kind that floats in cliches, but the gritty, sweaty kind built from small steps and stubborn faith. I told others not to aim for perfect, just for 1% better every day. Read one page, walk one block, pray one sentence. Those were the bricks of transformation. I was living proof that small obediences could carve a new path. One Sunday, I stood at the front of the sanctuary to share my testimony. My voice trembled, but I spoke anyway about the curtains I once kept shut, the nights I thought I was forgotten, the book that found me, the church that welcomed me, the God who never let me go. Tears glistened on faces in the pews, and when I finished, the applause rose, not for my weight loss, but for the God who had turned ashes into something beautiful. I wept too, not from shame this time, but from joy too sweet to hold. I stand before the mirror now with the curtains wide open. Sunlight paints my shoulders, and I no longer flinch at the reflection, staring back. My body is softer in some places, stronger in others, but most of all it is mine loved, carried, redeemed. I smile, not because I reached a number, but because I reached freedom. When I walk into the church, I see pieces of myself in every hesitant newcomer, every woman tugging her cardigan close, every man hiding his eyes. I greet them with the words once given to me, "You are loved here," and I mean it, because love is what melted my chains, what turned my shame into soil for new growth, what carried me when my own strength failed. My story isn't about weight or willpower. It's about a God who finds us behind closed curtains and whispers us back into the light. It's about people who choose kindness over judgment, and about small steps that become a journey. Today, I help others begin that walk, one block, one prayer, one smile at a time. And as I do, I carry a quiet certainty in my chest. I was never forgotten, not for a moment.